Welcome to AEIOU, a podcast about Austria. I'm Andrew, your host. We left off in the last episode with the economic crash of 1873. As the historian Peter Judson writes, the crash, quote, challenged the largely unquestioned popular belief that a free market capitalist system would bring growth and prosperity to all of society, end quote. As we discussed in the last episode, the government of Austria in 1873 was dominated by the liberals, who embraced laissez-faire capitalism. Predictably, the political strains that emerged in reaction to the crisis of liberalism represented by the economic crash were those that questioned the underlying assumptions of liberalism. These strains included socialism, which challenged laissez-faire capitalism, nationalism, which challenged supranational Austrian identity, and populism, which challenged the rule of political elites. However, none of these currents had yet gained sufficient momentum to oust the liberals from the government in the November 1873 election. Despite the economic crisis, the liberals held on to power in this election with a large majority, 228 of 353 available seats. Beyond 43 seats taken by German-speaking conservatives, the remaining 82 seats were split between the Polish and Czech parliamentary clubs, which joined the conservatives in opposition. However, the liberal victory was less overwhelming than it might initially appear. For one thing, the majority supporting the government consisted of 6 parties, with the older liberal generation making up less than half of the government seats. The 5 other parties included the Fortschritts Club, or Club for Progress, which included the younger, more nationalistically oriented liberals, a centralist faction which consisted primarily of estate owners, a Ukrainian faction with 14 seats, a bloc of independents with 10 seats, and the tiny Vienna Democrats faction with 5 seats. Although the liberals remained in power, rumblings to expand the electoral franchise began almost immediately after the election. One suggestion, which was ultimately rejected, was the addition of workers to the Chambers of Commerce Curia of voters. In addition, the issue of the renewal of the compromise with Hungary was undermining the unity of the government and its support of the minister-president, Prince Adolf Wilhelm Karl Daniel von Auersperg. While the Liberals' parliamentary majority was not threatened, the more nationalistic progressives gained seats as the older, more established factions lost them. Even more seats shifted to the progressives with the ratification of the Treaty of Berlin in 1878, according to which Austria would be responsible for occupying and administering Bosnia and Herzegovina. Such a situation meant for the empire an even larger Slavic population than it already had, and it was already larger than the nationalistic progressives liked. Emperor Franz Joseph, disturbed at Auersperg's inability to achieve unity among his parliamentary bloc, dismissed him. The emperor subsequently appointed in February 1879 Karl Ritter von Stratemeyer as the new minister-president. He also appointed as Interior Minister Eduard Franz Joseph Graf von Taffa, who had previously served for a year and a half as minister-president. Elections were called for the summer under the 1873 electoral system. The results were disastrous for the liberals, although they remained the largest faction in the Reichsrat. Their number of seats fell by nearly 40% to 91. Conservatives increased their share from 43 to 57 seats, but the big winners were the Slavic clubs, which now had a total of 111 mandates split nearly evenly between the Polish and Czech clubs. The 94 remaining seats were taken by deputies identifying with no party at all. The emperor elevated Taffa to minister-president after the election, and Taffa sought initially to continue governing with the liberals. However, ultimately finding it impossible to do so, Taffa eventually sought and established a more stable government among the previous opposition of conservatives, including the Catholic clergy as well as non-German ethnic interests. This coalition, dubbed the Iron Ring, in reference to its intention to constitute a protective ring around the emperor, governed until 1890. Among the Iron Ring's reforms was an adjustment in 1883 of the poll tax for urban voters, cutting it in half from 10 guldens to 5. The election to the Reichsrat held in 1885 under this new rule slightly increased the parliamentary shares of the Slavic parties and the liberals, but there were deep rifts that had formed in the latter group. Among the conflicts dividing the liberals was nationalism. As Judson writes in the context of the liberals' opposition to Taffa, the unexpected longevity of a hostile government undermined the traditional German liberal identification with the supranationalist Austrian state. If liberals portrayed nationalist unity as the highest social value in order to quiet class differences within the community of Germans, then that same standard had to be applied to relations between the community and the state as well. End quote. In particular, with Poles and Czechs now having a real say in government and Tafa relying on their support to be able to continue governing, concessions were made to both groups. Many Germans, fearful of losing yet more privilege, reacted. These fears had already given rise to the Linz Program in 1882, in which 5 German-speaking politicians of various political orientations had expressed their support for German primacy in the Habsburg monarchy. In addition, before the deputies elected in 1885 were even formally seated, the issue of nationalism had emerged in the matter of whether the Liberals, who had joined together in a bloc called the United Left in opposition to TAF, should rename itself the German Club. 84 deputies chose to rename the United Left the German Austrian Party, while 38 created their own German Club. The former, more moderate group drew its supporters from German-speaking communities in heterogeneously populated areas, which supported a strong central government. The latter drew from the German-majority Alpine provinces. In these provinces, federalism, or the belief that the central government should be weaker, with greater autonomy allocated to the provincial governments, was growing in popularity. In addition, a new form of nationalism announced its arrival in May 1885, called folkish nationalism. This form of nationalism de-emphasized civic life and identification with the state in favor of an emphasis on blood and ancestry. In addition to defining what it meant to be German far more biologically than previous forms of nationalism, folkish nationalism was also deeply anti-Semitic. Georg Ritter von Schönerer, a Reichsrat deputy and co-author of the Linz Program, carried the banner of Völkisch nationalism, issuing a public statement calling on German voters to embrace German ethnic nationalism. In addition to calling for transfer of control of non-German majority provinces to Hungary, or at least for a special status for such provinces, Schönerer made it clear who was to be excluded from the German nation, calling for the removal of Jewish influence from all areas of public life. If one acknowledges that the Jews in the Habsburg monarchy were among the greatest beneficiaries of Austrian liberalism, then it becomes easier to understand why some opponents of liberalism unfortunately saw a Jewish hand in the suffering that liberalism caused, even as that suffering extended to Jewish citizens as much as non-Jewish citizens. The available statistics on the 1885 election do not include a breakdown of votes by party. However, we do know that the Czech club gained 11 seats, the Polish club lost a seat, and the German conservatives lost 4 seats, for a net gain of 6 seats for Tafa's coalition. This outcome meant that the Iron Ring continued to hold power. The Liberals remained both the largest party and out of power. Jonathan Quan, an historian of Austrian liberalism, notes that the older generation among the Liberals managed to maintain their hold over the party due to factionalism among the younger generation. The series of electoral reforms that began in 1873 and culminated in the introduction of universal male suffrage in 1907 had as one predictable result the emergence of mass political movements and parties. Because these reforms began in the same year that the Viennese stock market crashed, the expansion of the franchise brought new ranks of voters who were freshly disillusioned by liberalism. As we've already established, one tendency that emerged from this disillusionment was nationalism. This tendency had already found expression not only in the radical Völkisch ideology of Schönerer, but also in the liberal nationalism of the progressives. However, over time, the positions taken by the liberal nationalists would come to more closely resemble those of Schönerer's followers, particularly where the so-called Jewish question was concerned. Describing the process by which nationalism sprang from the dying carcass of liberalism, Judson writes, quote, "In Austria, mass mobilization and greater democratization of the political system motivated politicians and organizers to adopt more radical positions in order to outflank opponents within their national communities. The more people gained the vote, the more politicians turned to nationalism to forge unity out of social diversity," end quote. Socialism also emerged as a potent political force during this period. Karl Marx had published the Communist Manifesto in the wake of the revolutions of 1848, but the reassertion of absolutism by Emperor Franz Joseph after the crushing of the Hungarian revolt that year had strongly deterred socialist activity. With the relaxing of authoritarian control in the 1860s, an organized workers' movement emerged. Within 2 years of the compromise with Hungary, socialist associations in Vienna had more than 5,000 members. The financial crisis of 1873 drove membership up further, but soon moderate and radical factions within the movement resulted in its splintering into smaller, weaker groups. Following the 1885 election, Victor Adler, who had also co-authored the Linz program as a nationally oriented liberal, undertook the difficult task of reuniting the splinters into a unified whole. By 1889, unification was accomplished and the Social Democratic Party of Austria was founded. A party program was published from Heinfeld in Lower Austria just in time for the new party to participate in the Second Workers' International Conference of Socialist Parties, which was held in Paris later the same year. The central government's initial reaction was hostile. When the new party marched in Vienna on May 1, 1890, clashes with police broke out. Nevertheless, the Social Democrats were not banned outright and participated in Viennese municipal elections later that month. The Heinfeld program had acknowledged the role of agitation in spreading socialism, but had also conceded the need to work within the parliamentary system to achieve reforms for workers to accrue political power. The last political tendency, but by no means the least important, to emerge in response to the crisis of liberalism was the Christian Social Party. While this movement has been strongly identified with Kurt Lueger, who was elected mayor of Vienna in 1897, the roots of the party were in the Catholic clergy and its own loss of social status due to the advent of liberalism. The party's origins lie with the minor noble Karl Freiherr von Vogelsang, a Catholic journalist of Prussian origin who immigrated to Vienna in 1864. He served as editor of the Catholic newspaper Das Vaterland. In that position, he enunciated some of the economic positions that would come to form the basis for Catholic social thought, which was conservative in its social orientation, but rejected both capitalism, which it associated with greed, and socialism, which it associated with envy. Instead, Catholic social thought opted for class collaboration through corporativism, a system in which corporate bodies of workers and business owners negotiated directly under the supervision of a central power, whether the government or the church. In addition, the Christian socials found strong resonance with parish priests who had begun to resent the Catholic bishops, whom the party identified with the sort of hierarchy it sought to level with its economic program. Vogelsang died in 1890, but his baton was picked up by Lueger. As party leader, Lueger found that the burgeoning party's constituency and the clergy could pair well with the economic concerns of the petty bourgeoisie of Austria's cities and large towns, where increasing industrialization had pushed out artisans and craft workers. Hostility to economic and social elites in both groups provided fertile ground for a populist approach. In addition, a belief common to the two groups was anti-Semitism. Although hostility to Jews was primarily a religious prejudice for the clergy, it was an economic one for the artisanal class, which identified industrialization with liberalism and strongly identified liberalism with Jews. Moreover, even among the clergy, the association of Jews with liberalism was an animating force. John Boyer, a leading historian of the Christian socials, writes, quote, "Jews ran the liberal newspapers which degraded the clergy's image, however, creating a form of cultural rivalry the clergy found as ominous as economic competition. Poorer Jews served clerics as objects of invidious self-esteem. To enhance their own social status, clerics attacked a non-dominant minority group." End quote. Although Lueger's anti-Semitism, which often found its way into his public rhetoric, was legendary, Boyer argues that after Vogelsang's death, anti-Semitism became a concern mainly of the party rank and file rather than the leadership. In either case, it was clearly a belief closely identified with the party. However, although both anti-Semitism and the desire to preserve German primacy in the empire characterized both the Christian socials and Schonerer's pan-German movement, the similarities ended there. Whereas Schonerer was anti-clerical because the Catholic-Protestant rift prevented the unification of all German-speaking people, Lueger drew a large number of priests into his party and sought special status for Catholicism in Austria. Lueger was a Habsburg loyalist, while Schonerer envisioned eventual annexation of German-speaking Austrian territories to the German Reich. Finally, while Schonerer's anti-Semitism was racial and thus absolute and irreconcilable, Lueger's was political. He saw anti-Semitism as a practical means to attack both liberalism and capitalism, with which Jews were readily associated. As the historian Karl Schorsky wrote, Luger, quote, tolerated the most vicious anti-Semitism among his lieutenants, but more manipulator and machine builder than ideologue, he himself employed it rather than enjoyed it, end quote. Despite some early cooperation, Schonerer and Luger disliked each other, and while Schonerer's tendency toward violent criminality and hostility to Rome undercut his ability to build a viable political mass movement, Luger was wildly popular, and the Christian Socials eventually became one of the largest parties in Austria. This is where domestic politics stood as Austria entered the 1890s. And we'll end here for this episode and pick up next time with the election of 1891. Thanks for listening.